Good afternoon in Washington. Good evening in Europe. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a wonderful event for you this afternoon, Washington time, on what's happening next in Belarus after the amazing Prigozhin affair. We will have a message to start from Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, the national leader of Belarus, followed by a panel discussion that includes Ryhor Astapenia, who's the director of the Belarus Initiative at Chatham House, David Kramer, who's the executive director of the George W. Bush Institute, Hanna Lyubakova, a longtime senior fellow, non-resident fellow at the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, and also a journalist from Belarus, and Brian Whitmer, who's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. So please, we start with record the statement from Ms. Tsikhanouskaya. Then we'll come to the panel.
Dear Ambassador John Herbst, dear David, dear Hanna, dear Shelby, dear friends of Belarus, I would like to thank the Atlantic Council for your many years of support of the Belarusian democratic movement. Thank you for keeping Belarus high on the political agenda in Washington, D.C. and worldwide. When all eyes are on Russia and Ukraine, it's sometimes forgotten that Belarus is also part of the puzzle. The so-called Prigozhin's mutiny on June 24 showed how shaky the Russian regime is and what a dangerous game it is playing. We are witnessing what could become the collapse of Russia. We have seen Putin's weakness. Unfortunately, for now, the events ended up not like we expected. And they ended up probably in the worst possible way for Belarus. Once again, of Lukashenka. Russian domestic conflict escalated to our territory. The announced presence of Wagner mercenaries in Belarus may have very dire consequences for our sovereignty. In addition to Russian troops and nuclear weapons, now we expect to have Russian thugs and criminals. We don't know yet how many of them will come to Belarus, what role will they play, how loyal, if at all, they will be to Lukashenko, whether they will be integrated into the Belarusian army or not. Wagner's presence in Belarus is a threat not only to Belarus independence, but also to our neighbors. We can't exclude provocations against Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and especially Ukraine. There is no doubt that Lukashenko won't control Wagner's mercenaries, as he won't control Russian nuclear weapons. Belarusians certainly don't welcome Wagner mercenaries to Belarus. They are also against Russian nuclear weapons in our country and against Belarusian involvement in the war against Ukraine. Considering the scale of repression and police terror, it's very hard to organize the protest. The terror became even more brutal with the beginning of the war. People are arrested every day for messages on social media, for speaking Belarusian, or for wearing the banned white-red-white combination of colors. Human rights defenders speak about 1,500 political prisoners in Belarus. Their real number is estimated to be 3 times bigger. Among them are my friend Maria Kolesnikova, journalist Igor Losik, former presidential hopeful Viktor Babarika, our Nobel Prize winner Ales Belyatsky. Many political prisoners are kept in an incommunicado mode. For months, we can't get any information about them. Even their lawyers are not allowed to see them. Yesterday, I received an anonymous text message saying that my husband Sergei died in Zhodina prison. There is no way to verify this. I haven't heard from Sergei since March 9. It seems that all this time he has been in a punishment cell. And such messages are used as an instrument of pressure on me and other Belarusians. But all their efforts to break us are useless. Belarusians won't give up until all Russian occupiers leave Belarus, and until Belarus becomes a free and democratic country. We stay in touch with Belarusians inside the country and in exile. We work on a common plan of action. On the ground, we have brave and resilient people who have not given up. We have railway partisans who stopped the movement of Russian troops. We have tens of thousands of witnesses who send us information about every sign of the Russian presence on Belarusian soil. We have those who spread self-made newspapers in their communities, those who preserve our national identity. An open street protest is not possible these days in Belarus, but my goal is to maintain people's will and desire for change, to keep them mobilized, informed, and united despite state terror and the harshest repressions Europe has seen in decades. We are strengthening our structures. We are building the United Transitional Cabinet and the Coordination Council, which represents a broad spectrum of Belarusian society and NGOs. And our task is to build a wide democratic movement which would unite all the Belarusians inside and outside the country. Outside, we have diasporas, independent media, and civil society who crowdfund, advocate, and collect evidence of human rights violations. We have built an alternative state to be ready to take over after the regime collapses. We work closely with Ukraine. We have common strategic interests and a common enemy. Lately in Kiev, my representatives had several high-level engagements. It seems that Ukraine is open for closer cooperation with Belarusian democratic forces. And there are no illusions anymore about Lukashenko. The fates of Belarus and Ukraine are intertwined. There will not be free Belarus without free Ukraine, and vice versa. Therefore, we ask our Western allies to increase support for Ukraine, but also for freedom fighters in Belarus. Let's not have illusions. Dictators cannot be appeased. They cannot be re-educated. Only coordinated pressure can force them to retreat. Unfortunately, existing sanctions don't work in full due to many loopholes. This is why it is especially important for Washington and Brussels to coordinate their efforts and sanction enforcement mechanisms. We deal with an organized criminal gang here, which does everything to circumvent sanctions. The West should impose additional sanctions on Russia not only for the invasion of Ukraine, but also for its attempts to undermine Belarus' sovereignty. It must send a strong signal that such attempts won't be tolerated. The West should stop pretending that Lukashenko is a president. He is not. Our language shapes reality, so let's stop calling him president. He's a criminal who seized power, and Lukashenko must be brought to the tribunal alongside Putin and Prigozhin. It is obvious that the Belarusian people and Lukashenko's regime are not the same. The regime helps Putin to implement the policy of colonization and occupation of Belarus. But the people are resisting it even under mass repressions. This is why improving Belarusians' mobility and supporting them on the international level is very important. We welcome the United States' decision to start a strategic dialogue between Belarus democratic forces and Washington. It will formalize our relationship and strengthen Belarus-American friendship. We already have a contact group in the Council of Europe, and last week we had the first meeting of the consultative group between the EU and Free Belarus. We also welcome the nomination of an American special envoy to Belarus. We are looking forward to it. We hope that the envoy will keep Belarus high on the agenda, as the former ambassador Julie Fisher used to do. We want to hear from the West. The world stands for independent and democratic Belarus. Belarus is a part of Europe. We will not allow Russia to occupy Belarus. Russian nuclear weapons must be taken away from Belarus immediately. And this would be the message we want to hear. The situation creates great risks, but also can unexpectedly open a window of opportunities for us to bring changes in our country. We have a historic chance to set Belarus free from the Russian sphere of influence. Our goal is to stay united, to stay brave, and to catch the moment when it comes. In this difficult task, we count on full support from our Western partners. But in the end, it's only Belarusians themselves who can make Belarus free. Thank you.
Well, that was an excellent opening statement. So now it's turned to our panel. So, Mr. Ostapenia, what exactly was Lukashenko's role, to the extent that you can see it, in ending the Prigozhin mutiny? The official line is that he brokered a deal, but there are also reports in Russia that the repressive organs persuaded Wagner to back down by threatening the family of the leaders. And there are even articles suggesting that Putin orchestrated the whole thing, the mutiny and the terms of the stand down. Also, how good is Lukashenko's safety guarantee to Prigozhin? And how many Wagner mercenaries are in Belarus? In fact, is Prigozhin himself in Belarus?
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador. Good afternoon and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be in such esteemed company. I think when we strip away the noise, we see that Lukashenko's role was rather mundane, and he became involved in a negotiation process which was undoubtedly broader than Lukashenko, Prigozhin, and Putin, and he took some responsibility for at least implementing part of the deal. And Lukashenko actually demonstrated his usefulness for the Kremlin and helped it to avoid an epic battle between its two armies near Moscow. So that is why I think that actually, while Lukashenko tries to exaggerate his role, and we should also think how not to underestimate it, because we can just take a look at concessions and prices Russia pays to Lukashenko. We can just see the prestige. This also includes public recognition of Lukashenko being kind of a political genius who saved Russia, etc. And also discounts for gas and oil, and also some increased imports. So we'll see that in the future. But again, I really doubt that actually it was like all parties in Russia wanted to escalate, and it was only Lukashenko who wanted to de-escalate, and he found proper words in order to found peace between all parties. Regarding the security guarantees Lukashenko provided to Prigozhin, I think that we should probably start from the fact that, well, it's the only assurances that Prigozhin currently has, and it's possible that if he chooses the path of self-abnegation, that these guarantees could prove sufficient. But on the other hand, I think that if we imagine that Prigozhin starts talking once again about the Russian army and about Russia's ruling elite, I really doubt that Lukashenko will be able to stand between the Kremlin and Putin. So I think that is why much depends on Prigozhin's future actions and how he handles the situation, how he handles this, let's say, 1,000 or so fighters that will come to Belarus. The Belarusian budget is unlikely to have funds to have them in Belarus, considering that actually they have shown that they are able of unconventional actions against their clients. So that's why I think this is not going to happen. And also, if Prigozhin faces financial restraints, I think that there will not be much choice for the Wagner but to seek employment elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Whitmore, assuming that Lukashenko brokered the deal, what does that say about Lukashenko's relationship with Putin and Lukashenko's ability to avoid making further concessions to the Kremlin? I mean, Lukashenko's weakened position as a result of Ms. Tsikhanouskaya's victory in the election 3 years ago is what gave Putin additional influence in Belarus as relates to nuclear deployments and perhaps launching part of the offensive against Ukraine 16 months ago from Belarus. Again, what do you think?
Well, thank you, Ambassador Herbst, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for the invitation. I agree with Rihar. I'm not entirely convinced, to put it really mildly, that Lukashenko is acting on his own initiative here. I mean, the way I look at Russia is that it behaves like a crime syndicate, and Putin's the godfather. Prigozhin was an underboss, not anymore. Lukashenko is an underboss, and I think one of the underbosses got some instructions to carry out a task. That's kind of in the very simple way I look at this. Also, you have to bear in mind the less than ideal personal relationship between Mr. Putin and Mr. Lukashenko. They do not like each other. And it seems highly unlikely that Lukashenko would have been able to convince Putin to go in a direction he didn't want to go. Some reports I am seeing are suggesting that it was actually the Tula governor, Alexei Dumin, who's a former bodyguard of Vladimir Putin, who actually was the interlocutor with Prigozhin. There are also reports, this being Russia, there's intrigue upon intrigue, that Dumin was also potentially flirting with joining Prigozhin's rebellion. So we can take that for what it's worth. Again,
who was flirting?
Dumin.
Okay.
Dumin. I've seen both, that he was the one of those two that brokered the deal, and also that he was flirting with Prigozhin. Again, we don't know, right? We're looking at data points, and we're back to our grandfather's Kremlinology here in a lot of ways. But the other data point to really bear in mind here, and I'd be really curious to hear what our Belarusian colleagues think of this, is that there have been persistent rumors for a long time that Lukashenko is very ill. He certainly doesn't look good. In his latest public appearances, he certainly looks ill. And this leads to the question of, is a succession looming in Belarus at this moment, right? On top of everything else we have going on with Russia's war in Ukraine, the counteroffensive, now the Prigozhin's rebellion, and do we possibly have a succession looming in Belarus? And in this situation, the presence of Wagner in Belarus, the presence of Prigozhin in Belarus during a potential succession struggle adds a whole new dimension of this. Alyaksandr Lukashenko has long wanted to kind of pass the torch to his son Victor, and has been positioning him for that for years. And one of the things I know we're going to talk a little bit more about the Ukraine piece of this later. But for as far as Belarusian domestic politics, I'm wondering what domestic benefits this could have for Lukashenko. Is this some kind of a deal between Putin and Lukashenko, where they agree on who the successor will be, and Wagner would be there to help guarantee it? Again, I am speculating like crazy, because again, John, we're back to our grandfather's Kremlinology here. We just don't know. I'm looking at data points and trying to figure it out. But that's how I see Wagner's presence in terms of Belarusian domestic politics at the moment.
Smart to throw Lukashenko's health into the mix, Brian. Thank you. Okay, Ms. Lyubakova, what has been the reaction, to the extent you can gauge it, of the Belarus people to, one, the news of the deployment of Russian nuclear weapons in Belarus, and two, the announcement of Prigozhin and Wagner coming to Belarus?
Thank you, Ambassador. So both questions are great, both angles here. So I will perhaps start with the Wagner one, because it's more complicated to answer. So the honest answer would be that we don't really know, because we don't have the exact picture at this moment, because no survey has been published yet, unlike in Russia, where Levada Center had published the survey on Prigozhin. But what I was able to, like the moods I was able to gain when I spoke with people inside the country, not necessarily anti-Lukashenko, they actually said that they're not that enthusiastic about this potential arrival of Prigozhin and Wagner militants to Belarus. They do have many questions, like what are they going to do in Belarus? What their role would be, what capacity? It's scary. It's like not unclear. They were involved in wars before. So I think this fear that people feel is kind of tangible. But apart from this anecdotal evidence that I've just mentioned, there was also a very interesting piece of sort of evidence, I would say, published by Propaganda. One of the most odious propagandists, Ihor Tur, actually published a post in which he said that many Belarusians, like part of the society, received the news about Wagner arrival very negatively. This was a quote, very negatively. And then the same propagandist is talking about how we should improve the image of Wagner. These are not only people with sledgehammers running around scaring people, but actually very reflective and thoughtful people as well. And we actually see how now propaganda is trying to change this image, and they even I think employed for that matter, perhaps one of the Wagner militants with Belarusian roots, Belarusian citizen, and he's now talking about Wagner, about how he is one's dialect and so on. So we see that here propaganda is trying to change the image. I think a really important question would be how the military will perceive this. I think they will also have many questions. Well, first of all, who will now pay Wagner mercenaries in Belarus? Putin just recently said that the Russian state paid them like billions of dollars. So I think that's a good question that they might be asking, right? Because they are underpaid for sure. Like, are they going to be instructors? For how long they're going to stay, and so on. So I think there is a lot of confusion here. And Lukashenko and Viktor Khrenin, the Minister of Defense, mentioned that Wagner can become part of the Belarusian army as a separate unit, which is, again, sounds very unrealistic. So I think there is a lot of fear. To sum it up, the first part of it, there is a lot of fear about the like Wagner as mercenaries coming to Belarus, but also many people understand that it would also decrease the relationship with other countries, with our neighbors, because of this potential threat coming from Wagner militants. And perhaps quickly on nuclear weapons, because it's kind of easier in more, we have here more facts. So we have the Chatham House brilliant research that Pena was part of. So since last year, it has become clear that most Belarusians are against the deployment of Russian troops. Around 80% on average, they don't support this. The latest data that was published in March this year suggested a slight decrease of this opposition, so 74%, which means that it's still the majority, but it means that the propaganda here is perhaps working, and I think they would be trying to explain the need to protect Belarus from NATO and the West. These are the narratives that propaganda is saying regarding nuclear weapons. So this is their main point. And as we see, it does work a little because these numbers are sort of decreasing when it comes to the opposition towards the deployment of nuclear weapons.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. Let me just point out before I turn to David, that this speaks to the complexity of everything that we're discussing, because you're describing how in Belarus, they're trying to improve Wagner's image, but what we're seeing out of Russia is they're trying to diminish it. So how does that all play out? And with that, David, what is your interpretation of what happened in Russia? Is Prigozhin actually in Belarus? And is he done as a player in Russia?
John, thanks for having me, and it's great to be with such a distinguished panel. As Brian said, this is back to Kremlinology days, and figuring out what really is going on is a real challenge, I think, for those of us on the outside. The immediate precipitating event, I think, was the order to bring all the private military companies, which technically are illegal in Russia, under the control of the Ministry of Defense. And Prigozhin felt that that would lead to his losing control over the Wagner forces. But this has been a battle brewing since really last fall between Prigozhin and Defense Minister Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff Gerasimov. And it just reached a point, about 10 days ago, where Prigozhin decided to order his forces to move on Moscow. They moved ahead with remarkable ease. They did have to down a few helicopters and a plane, killing apparently 13 Russian soldiers in the process. But then with the intervention, there was a sudden order to reverse and go back to Rostov, and that Prigozhin would be allowed to go to Belarus. There were reports in the Russian media today, I believe, that Prigozhin may have been in St. Petersburg, receiving funds that had been seized, even a pistol of his that was a favorite. Who knows what really is going on here? It is a bit of a mystery. It has prompted Putin to become more active, reaching out to crowds than we have seen him really since before the pandemic. And Putin is obviously trying to put ahead the image that he remains fully in control. The conventional wisdom, as we all know, was that this showed Putin weaker. That may be true to some extent, and yet at the same time, paradoxically, he may emerge from this in a more consolidated position. Having seen the threat that Prigozhin presented, having dealt with it, preparing his National Guard in particular for any other threats that might emerge, Putin actually may be able to consolidate his power after this. Prigozhin, I think, will be a spent force. And the last thing I'll just say is I would not want to be holding the life insurance policy on Mr. Prigozhin these days.
Okay, David, thank you. All right, Mr. Ostapenia. Some analysts suggest that Prigozhin and Wagner moving to Belarus would make it easier for Russia to open a new line of attack on Ukraine from the north. Of course, that happened during the initial invasion. What impact would a buildup of Russian troops in Belarus have on Lukashenko's standing at home? If Putin were able to force Lukashenko to send some of his troops to Ukraine, what would be the political impact in Belarus?
Thank you. I think that the presence of Russian forces is not a threat to Lukashenko at the moment, but recent operations conducted by, let's say, probably Ukrainian army in Russia, these operations have heightened concerns in Belarus that in the event of mass shilling from the territory of Belarus, then that Ukraine may retaliate for these attacks. And this scenario presents a much more difficult and challenging and serious, dangerous situation for Lukashenko. And when we look at Lukashenko's action, he's actually trying to do a lot to avoid involving into the war. Previously, we talked a lot about it based on reasons, on like arguments that actually that the war is unpopular in Belarus, that actually Belarusian army doesn't have offensive capacities, that actually Russia is satisfied with the way it currently uses Belarus in this war against Ukraine. But now we can see that actually not involvement in the war is kind of a decision that already made based on specific incidents that happened in Belarus and in Russia. For example, according to leaked documents, Ukrainian security agency sabotaged A-50 aircraft in Belarus. There were some Ukrainian rockets, anti-aircraft missiles that have fallen on Belarusian territory. Actually, let's say probably Ukrainian army conducts military operations in Russia, and probably Belarus and Lukashenko more specifically as an ally is supposed to react in a more direct manner than he is currently responding to these challenges. So I think that is why we should just take a step back and think about Lukashenko's rationale at the moment. He thinks that he's likely emerged as a huge winner of the whole situation. He regained some of his agency in relations with Russia, thanks to Prigozhin. He is currently kind of comfortable with the West because the West doesn't have economic leverage or some tools for economic pressure on the regime. Economy in Belarus is growing, repressions crush the democratic movement because of the war, societal views changed. And actually what they hope for, what the regime is hoping for, is that in a year, some political leaders in the West might change, and also that because of the lack of unnecessary weapons, Ukraine will not be able to have a decisive victory in this war. So that is why, in the word of Lukashenko, he is looking quite optimistic. And there is only one thing that actually could topple everything. It's being drawn into this war. And that could lead to missile attacks on Belarus, that will lead to military operations inside the country, it's massive emigration, political destabilization, etc. So I think that is why he will do a lot to actually just to avoid being drawn to the war. But again, probably it's not just even his decision, because he can't control Russia's military operations in the country. So Russians can fire missiles against Ukraine, and Ukraine may retaliate. And that's pretty it. And it will not be a Lukashenko decision. So I will stop here. Thanks.
Thank you. Very interesting comments. Okay, Mr. Whitmore, Russian nukes are now reportedly moving to, if not in Belarus. Again, some analysts are talking about Wagner or other Russian forces attacking Ukraine from Belarus. Meanwhile, Lukashenko has said that Wagner forces in Belarus pose no danger to his NATO neighbors. Should the West take any measures in response to the movement of the nukes and Wagner to Belarus, to the launch of Russian missiles from Belarus? And what should the West do if, again, Russian troops attack Ukraine from Belarus? But please unmute, Brian, so we can hear you.
I was muted. Thank you, Ambassador Herbst. That was an excellent question. First, I want to say I do agree with Rihor that the last thing that Lukashenko wants to do is to get drawn directly into this war that would potentially threaten his grip on power. As far as the tactical nukes in Belarus, I largely see this as a psyop. I'm willing to be shot down on that. I'm willing to be, no pun intended, I'm willing to be proven wrong on that. But the way I see it is this is largely a psyop. It's part of a much larger Russian operation to highlight nuclear weapons whenever and wherever possible, because there's acute awareness in the Kremlin that every time somebody in Russia says nuclear weapon, people in Washington and Brussels begin scurrying under their desks, right? This is a psyop to get us to be worried that Russia is going to potentially use nuclear weapons, that this conflict could escalate, and maybe perhaps tamp down our support for Ukraine. So I think that's what's really going on here. I'm not a military analyst, but I speak to a lot of military analysts, and nobody really sees a lot of strategic or tactical advantage to putting tactical nukes in Belarus. If Russia wanted to hit Ukraine with a tactical nuke, it could do it from Russia. And if Russia wanted to hit the West with a tactical nuke, it could do it from Kaliningrad. So I just don't see the advantage in any way, shape, or form here. And thus I've kind of come to the conclusion that this is just largely a psyop. Again, we had Medvedev the other day yapping on about how nuclear war is inevitable. We see this coming up every single day. So it's again, I would kind of be careful about reading too much into this. Something I do worry about is a fresh assault on Ukraine from the north, and I worry about this more with Wagner in Belarus. Now, the military analysts I speak to say that Russia really doesn't have the capacity to launch a fresh attack on Kyiv, because we'd be talking about Kyiv if we're talking about an attack from the north from Belarus. And the most military analysts I speak to say that Russia just doesn't have the capacity, doesn't have the manpower for that at the moment. If we begin to see troops massing on the border, well, then I'm going to get nervous again. Then I'm going to get very, very worried about this. As far as your question about what the West should do, I think the West should take a two-track approach here. On one hand, we should basically treat the Lukashenko regime as if it were an extension of Russia, because it is. Lukashenko is a wholly owned subsidiary of Putin Incorporated right now. He really doesn't have a lot of agency. The dreams we had before 2020 of potentially peeling him away from Russia are dead now. The only future for Belarus that is with the West is without Lukashenko. So we should effectively be treating this regime as if it were an extension of Russia. But on the other hand, and this is going back to Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's comments at the beginning of the event, I think we should double down on our engagement with Belarusian civil society. We can do this two-track approach, but this regime we should not have any illusions about this regime. We should be treating it as an extension of Russia. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Brian. All right, Ms. Lubakova, what would you like the West to do in the current circumstances to further support Tsikhanouskaya and to deter Lukashenko from further involving Belarus in Russia's war in Ukraine?
Thank you. I would first add to what Brian actually mentioned regarding the potential offensive from the north, from the territory of Belarus. Of course, we don't know with what and how many Wagner militants are coming to Belarus. So only after we would, I think, learn this, we would be able to say or speculate here or to discuss it, because maybe they will just come without any heavy military equipment and so on, right? So it will be hard for them. There is one camp that is being built right now in the Mahilo region, and apparently there might be around 8,000 mercenaries stationed there. And let's also remember regarding this point that in the past months, the Belarusian regime has sent hundreds of tanks and heavy military equipment and munition to Russia. So this is another point that we must remember regarding this potential offensive and whether it's going to happen at all. So regarding the strategy, I mean, that's a brilliant point. We've been discussing this for, I don't know, the past 3 years. So I think, first of all, the strategy must be comprehensive and consequent. I usually speak about this as like 3 pillars that it must have, because 3 is a good number to remember. And it's also very easy to, I think, discuss and describe. So, of course, what Svetlana Tikhanovskaya mentioned, there should be assistance. And I cannot really highlight it even more, because civil society plays a huge role right now, not only in mobilizing people, but also performing other critical functions, such as the depriving the regime of legitimacy or becoming alternative institutions to the state. Of course, more than 1,200 civil society organizations have been dissolved, liquidated right now, but many relocated and work from exile, and they never stopped operating. Look at the example of human rights defenders. This is how they continue operating and helping people on the ground. Media is becoming one of the most important, crucial tools for how to reach audiences inside Belarus. And there is an immense body of research that confirms that how people perceive, how people look at the war against Ukraine is actually shaped by the sources they consume, at least in Belarus. So we must definitely support media. And I've been working since 2020 as a consultant to 8 independent media outlets. And I can confirm that media do have outreach, and they actually focus very often on non-politicized audiences. And this is something that we've been working on and also developing. So regarding the US and US support, per year, it's around $30 million. And while it helped maintain operations and sustain the movement, there are indicators, there are rumors that this support can be reduced. So my advice is that this cannot be decreased, only increased, because especially now when there is a real threat to the independence of Belarus and the erosion of information sovereignty. When it comes to pressure, I think this is more sort of not complicated, but perhaps a controversial topic, because there are many opinions here. First, sanctions have already been wide, 40 countries have already imposed some restrictions on trade with Belarus. It did not, hasn't changed yet the regime's behavior, because they were slow, because there are so many loopholes. Also, Svetlana mentioned this previously. But what can be done now, and where we can definitely work, US can work, and the EU together for sure, is how to close these loopholes. I've been thinking about this similar group to your Mark McFall group on sanctions. Something like that can be also perhaps established towards Belarus, and to stop the evasion of sanctions. Because when it comes to money, the regime is super, super creative. And perhaps the last point, and I'm not going to go into that very deeply, because I'm not a lawyer. I just speak to lawyers as Brian to military analysts. But I think also another point is tribunal. This is something we've been discussing, and there are definitely reasons for that. There are grounds. The forcible transfer of children, not only to Russia, but also to Belarus, torture and that can be amounted to crimes against humanity, coaggression, and some other grounds. So this is where the ICC or regional tribunals can also work and kind of can be established. So these, I think, the directions where we can expand and work together.
Anna, thank you. That is a comprehensive and impressive answer. Okay, David, what should the goals of the US and the West towards Belarus be? And should that policy change in light of the latest developments and our objectives?
I don't think the policy objectives should change at all, John. I think our objectives and goals should be to see democratic transition in Belarus. And that means recognizing Svetlana Tikhanovskaya as the winner of the 2020 presidential election. As she rightly pointed out in her earlier remarks, we shouldn't be treating Lukashenko as president of Belarus. He is completely illegitimate. And we should do everything we can to apply pressure on him and those who support him to make it clear that there are penalties for supporting such a dictatorial regime there. We have to recognize that Lukashenko is a threat not only to his own people, but to others in the region. We saw the essentially the hijacking of the Ryanair flight from Athens to Vilnius over Belarus territory in order to secure the arrest of a Belarusian blogger. We saw the weaponization of migrants and asylum seekers in the fall of 21, trying to punish Poland and Lithuania and other countries that supported sanctions against Belarus. And of course, we saw Lukashenko allow Belarusian territory to be the ground from which Russia launched part of its invasion in February of 22 last year, the invasion into Ukraine, and now the positioning of Russian tactical nuclear weapons. I agree with Brian that this is largely a psyop, but it also enables Russia to position more of its forces on Belarusian territory in order to maintain physical control over these weapons. And that means further erosion of Belarus's sovereignty and independence and territorial integrity. So we are seeing by the day, Lukashenko allowing this destruction of Belarus as a separate nation, allowing Putin and now Wagner forces to come in and essentially undermine that. And we have to remind ourselves and to signal to the people of Belarus that we continue to support their independence, their sovereignty, their territorial integrity, and we support a democratic transition in that country.
David, thank you very much. Okay, we're now taking audience questions. We'll start with a question from James Durant. To what degree does the Belarusian military have freedom of action independent of the Russian military? How responsive would it be to Lukashenko in the unlikely event he chose to pursue a policy course independent of or even in conflict with Putin? Anyone want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that Belarusian army is still following Lukashenko's orders. It's quite clear that despite the fact that there are many integration projects in the military sphere between Belarus and Russia in the air defense, in other spheres, well, it's pretty simple that Belarusian army is still an army of Lukashenko. But we can imagine that in the case that there will be officially war, because actually no one is conducting official war at the moment, right? And if there will be an official war, so there are like several documents that we know how that you have to follow them, and in a way there will be more integration between the Belarusian and the Russian army and more control of Russia over Belarusian army.
Thank you. All right, we have a couple of questions relating to Wagner in Belarus. One is from Phil Brandazzo. I'll put them together as a single question. And he says, Prigozhin is too valuable as a war organizer. He's in Belarus. Why wouldn't Belarus observe Wagner Group and expand its role into Belarusian forces, thereby increasing Belarus's relative power? That assumes, of course, that there are lots of Wagner troops heading towards Belarus, which we don't know yet. And according to Prigozhin from a few days ago, that's not happening. And then a question from Dave McLaughlin. Do we have a sense on how the Belarusian security services have reacted to the potential presence of Wagner forces on Belarusian territory? David, you want to give that a shot?
I saw Hannah unmute, so I'll let her go first.
Okay, Hannah, over to you.
I'll just add regarding this potential integration into the Belarusian army, right? That was the question. So again, what is the mechanism? How are they going to be integrated? They have Russian passports, I assume. Can they be part of the Belarusian army? How much money will they get? Are they going to agree to these salaries? Because, well, apparently they received quite high salaries before. Do they want to be part of the regular army? They are the ones who, I used to fight. So there are kind of many questions. Like, of course, again, what the Minister of Defense, Viktor Hrenin, said, that, well, he would like to see them as a separate unit in the Belarusian army, but there are so many questions how this can be done. And really quickly, also, it might be funny to mention, but still, being a mercenary in Belarus is a criminal liability, actually. So again, there are kind of many questions how the regime is going to deal with this one.
Okay, let me just point out one other thing. Lavrov was quick to reassure the Kremlin's African partners that whatever happened with Prigozhin, the Wagner or a Wagner-like presence in Africa was going to remain. Might all of this mean that if Wagner does in fact move to Belarus, we'll see a Belarus connection in Russian African operations? Anyone want to take a shot at that?
John, can I just say, and I know Brian wants to jump in too, but just very quickly, look, Wagner has a well-earned, horrible reputation for raping, murdering, pilfering, doing tremendous damage and destruction, whether it's in Ukraine, Syria, Libya, Mali, Central African Republic. It is one of the most murderous outfits that's out there. And so I would think that even the Belarus KGB, which is still called the KGB these days, probably is not very comfortable with having any Wagner element operating in Belarus. Not to say that they're going to go to war against the people of Belarus, but these are people who don't observe rule of law and only know how to hurt people. And that's not a group I'd want in my country.
Okay. One last audience question on Belarus from Bo Vesterlin. How can and will Lukashenko use Wagner troops against the democratic movement in Belarus? Hanna, you want to take that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? So
how can and will Lukashenko use the Wagner troops against the democratic movement in Belarus? Sorry, I've got something in my throat.
Oh, of course. So what definitely what the propaganda and the regime have been talking nearly, I think, every week is that they are sort of expecting, or that they've tried to, I think, scare people in Belarus that the Kalinowski regiment, those military volunteers that have been fighting on the side of Ukraine on the front line, that they are going to cross the border and they're going to attack Belarus, the state. So we must protect the Belarusian state and our stability and peace and so on. So I think they might justify, if this actually happens, if the real transfer of Wagner militants happens, they might justify their presence as the way of protect Belarus from this Kalinowski regiment. And perhaps this is how they're going to use it in that sense. But of course, again, the Kalinowski regiment is not going to attack Belarus anytime soon, or attack the regime. So these are just threats that the regime is trying to create to show that everyone is kind of trying to attack Belarus right now, be it NATO, EU, or Ukraine or Kalinowski regiment.
Thank you. Rihor, you want to jump in?
Well, yeah, I can just add probably two cents here that probably we should stop thinking about Wagner exclusively, because if I were part of this criminal organization, I would probably start thinking about rebranding it. And that is why I think when we think about Wagner's activities in Africa or in other countries, probably they will just change their titles, names, etc., and they will still continue their operations. I see the hand of Brian. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question from Adam Blanco, picking up on an observation Brian made. Could Tula Governor Duman be the successor to Lukashenko, solidifying, in Putin's eyes, the integration of Belarus into the Russian Federation?
I really hadn't thought that through. That's like six-dimensional chess. I mean, I've heard Duman mentioned as a potential replacement for Shoigu as defense minister. I have not heard anything about him being a replacement for Lukashenko. I just wanted to also add just a few points on some of the previous questions that have come up. I mean, the Belarusian army is very, very small. It's only about 62,000 men under arms. And they're very poorly trained and very poorly equipped. And I really don't see the Belarusian army as a factor in its own right. This is one of the reasons, one of the kind of functions of Wagner in Belarus has been discussed, to train the Belarusian army. So it would be a better trained force. As far as Wagner itself, we have to be careful about assuming what Wagner is going to be going forward. Lavrov did reassure Russia's African partners that Wagner would remain, everything going on with Wagner in Africa would continue. But what Wagner is it going to be? There are rumors in the Russian media that Prigozhin's assets are going to be taken over by another oligarch. The name that keeps coming up is Yuri Kovalchuk, of course, the businessman who is very, 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 very close to Putin. He's probably one of the closest people to Putin in the entire elite. And that leaves the question: do those assets include Wagner? So we're going to see kind of Wagner being taken, or we're going to see a bifurcation of Wagner, kind of a Belarusian version of Wagner with Prigozhin and somebody like Kovalchuk taking over the main. Sorry, I don't know. Again, I'm just kind of putting together data points that I've been seeing so far, but I'd be careful about assuming what Wagner is going to be going forward and who is going to be controlling it. As far as Duman becoming the president of Belarus, he's a citizen of the Russian Federation, so I kind of have a hard time imagining him as president of Belarus. But I would say I think a succession is coming in Belarus, and that this is no small matter when this happens, especially given everything else that's going on. As I said at the outset, there have been long-standing rumors that Lukashenko is very ill, and right now he certainly looks it. He's not appearing in public as frequently as he does, and when he does appear in public, he does not look good. And this is making me wonder whether he is trying to set the stage to transfer power to his son Victor. If Russia's down with that, if there is if Russia and Belarus are on the same page about what the transition is going to look like, how is Belarusian civil society going to react to a transition situation? These are all known unknowns that we should be keeping an eye on going forward.
Thank you. I see our audience is still fascinated with Wagner. And so we have a good, I would say, just a facts, ma'am, question from Carl Alto. He asks, any signs that Wagner is in fact recruiting in Belarus? Any signs that the base near Stepovitsy is actually being prepared to house mercenaries? Anyone have any ideas on this?
I can
And then Rihar.
As I mentioned, there are first satellite images and also photos from the ground showing that there is definitely a base, there is definitely a camp being built, and these sort of tents are already ready. So journalists were able to count that there are around 300 tents, which gives us around 8,000 people that they can actually have. Regarding recruitment, Lukashenko said that Wagner is not going to recruit new people in Belarus. So this is what he said. This is the only information that we have at this point.
Thank you. Rihor, do you want to add to this?
Well, yeah, I can just add that Wagner doesn't have any recruitment centers in Belarus, but it can mobilize people, recruit people from Russia. So, and if anyone is willing to join Wagner, it can go to Russia and join the mobilization center there.
David?
Just very quickly, remember, Wagner was last recruiting in Russian prisons. And a lot of those prisoners who were given basically an offer they couldn't refuse wound up getting killed or wounded in the fighting in Ukraine. So it doesn't exactly have an attractive recruiting record for bringing people on board, unless basically the people being recruited didn't have much alternative.
Fair point. Okay. We have a question from Anthony Borden of the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. As for you, Hanna, you mentioned important work with Belarus exile media. What specific approaches can be successfully used to combat Russian disinformation in Belarus and among the broader Russian population? Fact-checking presumably will not work. What will?
All right, so another 30 minutes, please, to answer this. Well, I think most important, what we focused on was non-politicized audience, this neutral audience, not non-users, right? And this is, I think, the audience you should address in the first place, because we noticed that there is a decrease in willingness to read political news, political information. So let's keep this in mind. And second is platforms, like where they get this information from. Use whatever is possible. In Belarus, TikTok or YouTube or Instagram have not been banned. So this is where we operated a lot. And this became really successful. YouTube is like alternative television for Belarusians right now, and they do really watch it, as well as TikTok. And generally, the approach, I think, so formats are important, short stories, also human angle is very important. They really like, people really like stories about people as elsewhere. So just be creative here. And as successful examples, I can mention some really quickly. Like there was one TikTok about a dissident, Mikhail Avtuhovich, that was able to gather 500,000 views. Just one as an example, right? So still people do watch even news, even stories about political prisoners, if this is a human and has a human angle, a human story.
Thank you. Rihur, do you want to jump in on this as well?
Well, no, that's cool.
Okay, we got one last question then. What should the U.S. Congress be doing to help besides looking at sanctions, loopholes, and keeping funding going to Belarusian civil society? Hannah, this comes from your comments, so I'll give this to you, but everyone else can jump in if they want after that.
Sorry, I don't want to occupy too much space. Yeah, I mean, when it comes to loopholes, again, I think my proposal here would be to create a special task force to monitor sanction invasion, and also monitor the effectiveness of the sanctions that have already been implemented, because there have been many, right? But still, we don't really know whether they're effective and how they are being avoided. As two examples, I think really prominent, there was in 2021 the example of Mykolai Vorobey, this oligarch, Lukashenko's wallet, who was able to still sell oil to Estonia, and only the work of investigative journalists amplify this issue, investigated, and it was stopped after that. Regarding wood, the same issue. So EU imposed sanctions on wood, and the regime was able to avoid these sanctions through selling this wood to the EU by sham documents. So these are just two examples that could have been avoided if we would have had a special task force. When it comes to civil society, increased support, and also I think contact and communicate with people with civil society and ask them about their needs. This is what the EU is doing a lot. I know that the US is also doing this. In this US strategic dialogue, I think will also become a great platform for such discussions and for civil society to raise such issues.
Thank you. Okay, we've got 1 minute left. Rihur, 30 seconds for your final comments.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. I think that the only thing about sanction which I think is very key, is to understand that sanctions cannot be the only part of the policy strategy. We see that in the way that Lukashenko actually built his political system, that it's not actually so much integrated into the Western financial system. Belarus doesn't have many oligarchs outside the country. There are not so many money outside the country, etc. And Belarus has plenty of allies like China, like Russia, definitely, etc. That is why when we think about sanctions, we should clearly understand that, well, it's just a tiny part of the strategy that the West should have on Belarus.
Thank you. Brian, 30 seconds.
I would, give me a second here. I would second Hannah's suggestion of a special task force on sanctions evasion, not just regard to Belarus, but with regard to Russia as well. I would also like to see the International Criminal Court consider a war crimes indictment for Lukashenko for his complicity in enabling of this war. And finally, I would like to see both Russia and Belarus designated as state sponsors of terrorism.
Fine. David, the final word is yours.
The question about what Congress can do, I would argue, is to continue and sustain support for Ukraine to help Ukraine win, because the spillover effects of Ukrainian victory and Russian defeat will redound, obviously, not just to Ukraine's enormous benefit, but to Belarus's benefit as well, and eventually, one day, to Russia's benefit too. So support Ukraine, and the effects from that, I think, will be enormous.
Good final word. Thank you all for participating, and thank you for our audience for tuning in. And join us tomorrow for a discussion with some of the best minds from Russia on what the Prigozhin affair means in Russia.
Thank you.